Just to give you a bit about Mr. McConnell, he was appointed by Secretary Napolitano June 1st, 2009, and he's a counselor to the Deputy Secretary in the National Preparedness and Programs Directorate. He serves specifically as a cybersecurity counselor. Mr. McConnell previously served on the Obama-Biden presidential transition team, and previously Mr. McConnell was the director of the International Y2K Cooperation Center. He also served as the Chief Information Policy and Technology Director in the Office of Management and Budget from 1993 to 2000. So he has a really great experience. He's a leader in the cybersecurity industry. We're very fortunate to have him. We'll have him talk till about 8:30 tonight, and then we'll have some questions and answers, Mr. McConnell. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Professor Norton. It's really good to see that there's life, in fact, after DHS, as Professor Norton illustrates. So I'm really happy to be here on behalf of Secretary Napolitano and Undersecretary Rand Beers, who was your original speaker, and who I work for. I'm proud to be here to talk about Department of Homeland Security's efforts to strengthen the security of the nation and discuss some of our top priorities for 2010. And I'm really, so I'm happy to talk about these things, but I'm really at least as interested in hearing what you have to say and hearing your questions and having a dialogue around some of these issues. There was an article in New Republic today profiling Secretary Napolitano and pointing out all the great qualifications she has. She's a great politician. She might be the first person to become the governor of 2 different states, because she was the governor of Arizona, and then she might become governor of New Mexico somewhere a long time in the future. And a great politician and tough woman. But she basically has the worst job in town, because no matter what we do at Homeland Security, we're going to make some mistakes, and so we're responsible. I wanted to use this opportunity to talk to you about some of the challenges we face at DHS and how people like you, future leaders of our country in government and security, can help. And in particular, it's good to be here at Johns Hopkins because of the great program here. We have a strong relationship with Johns Hopkins. In general, hundreds of DHS employees have benefited from the top-notch education or professional development training opportunities you have here. And so we want to build our bench. DHS is relatively new. It seems like it's old. It's like 8 years old. That's relatively new in the government. And so we're a new agency. We're trying to build our bench, get the best and brightest talent into the agency. And so there's a lot of opportunities, a chance to get in on the ground floor of a startup. It's a rather large startup, 170,000 people, but you know what I'm talking about. So one of the ways that Johns Hopkins partners actually with DHS and with some of the other government agencies, including National Security Agency, which is a key partner of ours in the cybersecurity arena, is as a member of the National Centers of Academic Excellence. And we're using that program to leverage our ability to find people who are trained in cybersecurity. There's a big shortage in the world and in the country and in government of cybersecurity professionals, and so this program is very helpful to us. There's 106 actually academic institutions that are National Centers of Academic Excellence, and so we're trying to work to build a Homeland Security all-star team, especially in cybersecurity. Well, let me step back a little bit and talk to you about what are DHS's core missions and responsibilities in our country at this point. We're at a very pivotal time in American history. The attempted attack on December 25th was only the latest illustration of the fact that wily and determined terrorists are bent on killing Americans and disrupting our way of life. So the administration, the Biden administration, is determined to thwart those plans and to disrupt, dismantle, and defeat their efforts through multiple layers of defense working in concert with one another. So despite our name, Homeland Security, we're not the only ones responsible. The fight against terrorism is a broad one, and it involves all instruments of national power, diplomatic, military, economic, intelligence, and law enforcement. So you've probably studied the DIME paradigm, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, military. military and economic. And law enforcement, of course, is a big piece of it as well in this world. So we collaborate across the government. We collaborate inside DHS with state and local and international governments and with the private sector to improve our ability to protect America from our adversaries and to prevent, respond, and recover from the threats of all kinds. A lot of what my part of DHS, the National Programs and Protection Directorate, does is protect and think about protecting critical infrastructure. The internet is one of those, but so is power and finance and transportation sectors. And so the private sector is very much involved. This is not something that the government can do and fix. And yet there are some things that only the government can do. So part of the exercise that we're all engaged in as Americans, anyway, is to figure out how do we make that work. We have a traditional arm's length relationship between the government and the private sector in our country. And so figuring out how to make that work in an arena where many of our adversaries don't have that inconvenient but useful separation between government and citizenry, and finding ways to partner together that will be effective while preserving our national values is a great part of the art form. So it's a worthwhile thing to think about in your studies, in my opinion. So our goal is to build a ready and resilient nation and to create a culture of preparedness that involves partnerships with other governments and private sector entities and with the American public. So there's lots of things that we put out about, being ready and having backup plans for your household and things like that in those cases. And a lot of things people can do, especially in the cyber environment, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. So within DHS, we have a lot of different responsibilities. We are the home of the Transportation Security Agency, one of your favorite agencies, I'm sure, for those of you who travel, and the Border Patrol, and also FEMA, the Emergency Management Agency. So it's a really broad range of responsibilities. And the idea of the Congress in pulling these things together was to create a way of making the country more resilient and against both foreign and domestic threats and between natural and human-caused disasters. So recently Secretary Napolitano just released a report called the Quadrennial Homeland Security Review, the QHSR, affectionately known around DHS. And this is the first one, since we've only been in business for 8 years. And it laid out 5 missions that form the backbone of DHS's efforts to create a safe, secure, and resilient place where the American way of life can thrive. So the first one, I'll just enumerate these. First one is preventing terrorism and enhancing security in that context. Second, securing and managing our borders. The third one, enforcing and administering our immigration laws. Fourth, safeguarding and securing cyberspace. And fifth, ensuring resilience to disasters. So you can see, even by looking at this highest level, these 5 top missions, a couple things emerge. Number one is that this is the first time that cyberspace and cybersecurity has been pushed up to the top of the pile and is in now one of the top 5 missions. And so that's good news, I think, for everybody, and a symbol or an illustration, I guess, of the President's commitment to make cybersecurity a key national priority. The other thing that you can see is that all these missions are interrelated with each other. So enforcing and administering immigration laws has something to do with securing and managing our borders. Preventing terrorism is included in that as well, although there's obviously issues of domestic terrorism. And ensuring resilience to disasters. Resilience is something that's worthwhile to have, whether it's a natural disaster or some other kind of incident. So we're continually at work. We're a very operational agency. My past work in the government during the Clinton administration was involved in much more of a policy organization, the Office of Management and Budget, which is part of the White House. At DHS, everything is due tomorrow or today or yesterday, and so we're very operationally focused. on doing all these things, keeping the borders, the ports, the air lanes secure, enforcing immigration laws, protecting physical and cyber infrastructures, preventing and responding to disasters of all kinds, and ensuring the country remains resilient. And so one of our primary focus efforts is the attempt to look particularly at critical cyber and physical infrastructures, which is, as I said, the part of DHS that I work in. So if you think about critical infrastructures, there's actually a list of 18 of them, and I won't read them all off here. But you can imagine what they are. They range from the finance sector to energy to transportation to the defense industrial base, all the kinds of things that we depend on for the economy and just basic living to happen. And so those critical infrastructures are, for the most part, owned and operated by private sector organizations and entities. And so the art form is to find a way for us to partner with them and work with them to allow them to continue to do business and make money, and at the same and serve their customers, and at the same time keep the larger issue of national security and homeland security in mind. So that's why we talk about protection and resilience, because protection is sort of trying to stop it from happening, and resilience is making sure we can continue to operate after some bad things do happen. And so we have an elaborate we have these 18 sectors, and we have a national infrastructure protection plan that was recently revised in 2009, and it's also all about cooperating and working with the private sector to find ways of doing it. And at least for the most part to date, we are doing it with a minimum of regulation. There are some regulations, obviously. For example, in the chemical sector, DHS specifies what the standards are for protecting chemical facilities, both protecting the physical assets and the cyber assets in those facilities. Similarly, in some other sectors, other regulatory agencies, for example, in the financial sector, or a better example, probably the Nuclear Regulatory Commission sets standards for cyber protection and physical protection of nuclear power plants. That would be a good thing. So there are regulatory approaches that are necessary in some cases, and at the same time, a lot of it can be done through incentives and voluntary cooperation. And finding the balance between those is a continual challenge. So I want to talk a little bit about the sort of a shift that has been happening in the past few years, and that is that we've been focused in the counterterrorism community, so to speak, for looking at traditional attacks. And so we saw at 9/11, of course, using modes of transportation like airplanes to do harm. But there's also now an increasing awareness of the possibility to attack or use cyberspace as an attack vector. And so it's much more difficult, of course, to identify and capture the enemy, the adversary, in cyberspace than it is in the physical world. But if you can imagine a 2x2 matrix, okay, so think of a 2x2 matrix, and here you can tell that I was once a consultant, because you have to have 2x2 matrices if you're a consultant. That's a secret business secret that I'm giving out right now. So if you look down the left side of the matrix, right, there are you could talk about two attack vectors. The attack comes at you through cyber or comes at you through physical. And then across the top, you might look at two possible target classes, cyber targets and physical targets. So I want to talk about examples of those four quadrants there. So in the upper left, in the northwest quadrant, right, you have cyber attacks on cyber assets. So such as, for example, a malware or viruses that are used to attack your computer or your organization's computer, or, for example, a kind of economic espionage, i.e. theft of valuable intellectual property that was recently experienced by Google and by several dozen other prominent U.S. firms. So that's a cyber against cyber. In the lower right, in the southeast, there's physical against physical, so such as the bombing of the Moscow subway yesterday, right? This realm actually is a pretty well understood realm, and it's evolving, although it is also evolving as the articles this morning about the militia arrests show. So people are getting creative even in the physical, against physical piece. So, but of increasing interest are the other two blocks, the Northeast block. So up here you have cyber attacks on physical assets. So this scenario might involve the use of the internet, or the use of malware embedded in hardware that was embedded in hardware during its manufacture to destabilize an industrial control system. So there's a famous film that shows an electrical generator turbine spinning out of control and exploding from vibration because changes were made to its control circuits using, in a test, basically computer generated commands that linked into it because most or many industrial control systems are now controlled by computers. So, and it is, so that was one that was done kind of in real time with a internet type based attack. But there's also examples of not in control systems, but there are examples of bad things being embedded in hardware in the manufacturing cycle. So this is not a critical infrastructure example, but in the Great Britain and recently here, some point-of-sale terminals where you're swiping your card in the grocery store, right, have been modified during the manufacturing process so that not only do they send your credit card or debit card number and PIN to the card processor, but they also send a copy of that to criminals who can then use it for their own purposes. So that's the upper, the Northeast block cyber attacks on physical assets, and there's also, of course, the southeast corner, wherever I am here, of the matrix, which covers physical attacks on cyber assets. For example, somebody destroying an undersea communications cable using, regular physical attacks that could be very disruptive to international commerce. So you have to look at these things not as two different realms, cyber and physical, but very interrelated realms. And the increasing connection between the realms is illustrated in another way. The Russian invasion of Georgia, during that invasion, the attackers of some sort from someplace performed cyber attacks against key government and private sector computers before the Russian tanks rolled across the Georgian border. So there was a softening up of the infrastructure using cyber before they came in with the traditional weapons. And so, suffice it to say, cyber threats can impact both individuals and nations, and that cyber attacks are not decreasing. In fact, they're increasing in frequency, in sophistication, and scope, and it has significant implications for national and economic security. So where does DHS fit into this? DHS is charged with securing the federal executive branch civilian networks. We refer to this as the .gov domain. And we are also responsible for coordinating the response to private sector in the cyber domain. And since taking office, President Obama has made the protection of these strategic national assets, in his words, a top priority. He's recently appointed a cyber coordinator at the White House, and all the agencies are coming together to respond to this. So one of the things that we're doing right now, working with the federal agencies, is to reduce the number of places that the federal agencies connect to the internet, with the idea that if you have several thousand connections between all the government agencies and the internet, you're less able to control the traffic that's going in and out. You're less able to be aware and have a good awareness of what's happening on your network. So we're reducing that down to dozens as opposed to thousands of connections. And then on top of that, we have a program going on which is called Einstein, and through our Computer Emergency Readiness Team, U.S. CERT, we're putting on this Einstein technology, which basically detects threats that are coming in, and in its advanced stage, we'll be able to divert them or stop them, block them, so that we have a perimeter defense, if you will, around the government. It's a tricky thing because it means that in some cases we have to look at, obviously we have to look at the traffic that's coming into the government in order to see if it contains malware or other bad stuff. And so that creates issues about looking at mail that's coming, email, for example, that's coming from private citizens. And so we have on top of that a very not complex, but sort of strict privacy regime that deals with what we do if we happen to read somebody's name or something like that and capture private individual information during this transaction while we're looking for malware. So, but we use that information that we get about the malware, where it's coming from. We alert the other federal agencies so that they can defend themselves and work with the private sector, security companies and others to share information so that we're all aware of what's going on. Another piece of this, so that's kind of in the day-to-day preventive, stopping things that are attacking all the time. But you also have to deal with what happens when there's a major incident. And I was saying before, there is a lot of people besides DHS and the government who have to get involved in this, state, local, and private sector. So we're developing something called the National Cyber Incident Response Plan, affectionately known as the NCIRP, as the Italian pronunciation, NCIRP, that will basically is a coordinated effort to figure out how we're all going to respond, how the telephone companies and ISPs are going to respond, how the state and local governments are going to respond in the case of major cyber incidents. So this plan has been under development in a collaborative way. We started out basically with a blank sheet of paper and said, okay, how can we all work together to do this? And we're going to be testing it. We're going to run an exercise in September called Cyberstorm 3, and that's an attempt where we will try out this plan, see how it works, and find all the bugs in it, and so we can work it out and get it further going. So everyone will know what they're supposed to do if we have a major incident. So that's kind of at the corporate industrial level, if you will. In addition, though, we're interested in just what everybody, ordinary citizens, can do to promote and improve cybersecurity, because since we're all networked together, if your computer is not protected, then you can become you can be owned by a botnet herder, and you can become a part of a botnet, and your computer can be used to attack other people's computers and bring down systems in denial of service attacks and things like that. So in May of last year, the president called for a national cybersecurity public awareness campaign to basically make the American people more aware of cybersecurity and what they can do about it. And just last month, Secretary Napolitano unveiled a new thing called the new initiative called the National Cyber Challenge. And basically, what's happening there is that we have a contest going on. You can go to dhs.gov/cyberchallenge and send in your ideas about what are good ways of communicating to the American people about cybersecurity and why it's important, and whether there are things that relate to elementary school kids or teenagers or college-age kids or adults of all ages is the thing. And the ideas are due by April 30th, and we'll review all the ideas we have, and then we're going to have an event downtown with people from all over the country who come in, and we can talk about these various ideas and how we can move forward to them. So that's kind of the latest thing in the cyber arena. So the last thing I want to talk about is as I mentioned earlier, the Quadrennial Homeland Security Review, QHSR. So we are now moving from that to a build out of, okay, so we have these 5 mission areas, the so what of that, and how are we going to organize ourselves and work with all our partners to make that happen. And that's moving forward to a budget proposal that the president will propose early next year in the slow processes of government. This is actually fairly fast. That aligns us, and in particular makes the cyber and physical parts work together better, because they still are stovepiped within DHS and elsewhere in the world. And as I tried to illustrate earlier, they are very much connected. So that's still a work in progress. Obviously, all this is a work in progress. One of the things about working at DHS is that it is, which I recommend, is that there's a lot of opportunity to make things better. And in particular, there's a lot of opportunity to get things done because there's a lot to do, and our mission space is very broad, as I've tried to illustrate. And so we need great people to help us, either directly as government employees or in the private sector, to be thinking about all these infrastructure protections, whether it's physical or cyber. So with that, I try to throw out some issues on the table, but you probably have some others. You've all been thinking about some of these issues in national security and how they all fit together globally as well as locally. So I welcome the conversation. Thanks.
What are you telling Congress, or what would you ask Congress to do to support kind of the cybersecurity defense network, and what would you recommend?
Okay. So what would we recommend legislatively in cyber? So are we on? Do we have press here? Any press here? Okay, good. Well, that's fine. One's all it takes. So we'll say we're off the record. Okay. So so we're working with the Congress. There's a couple of bills that have come out recently, right? So on the House side, they just dropped a bill, H.R. 4900, which would create in the Executive Office of the President a new cybersecurity office. It's sort of like the cyber coordinator, but on steroids, much bigger office with more authorities. It's its own office, separate from the National Security Staff, which is where the cyber coordinator is currently located. So that's one approach. Then there's the Rockefeller-Snow bill and other bills on the Senate side, which would basically do something kind of similar, create a specific cybersecurity office, but instead of housing it in the White House, they would house it in Department of Homeland Security, and then they would have it report, at least in part, to the president. So that's an interesting, for those of you students of bureaucracy, it's an interesting thing to have something inside a department that nominally is under the secretary, right? We all work in my department, we all work for Secretary Napolitano, and then you have somebody who's reporting directly to the president, but it actually works in a couple cases. FEMA, the Emergency Management Agency, the head of FEMA reports to the president in emergencies to some extent. And similarly, in telecommunications policy, the National Telecommunications Information Administration reports, although it's a bureau of the Department of Commerce, reports to the president and advises him on telecommunications policy. So it could work out. Anyway, we've been looking at these bills, and we have not proposed anything yet. We think there's a lot of merit in some of the bills that are coming down, but it looks likely to us that this is going to take longer than this year to get done. The legislative calendar is very short this year. It's an election year. It's going to be a contested election, so the members are not eager to stick around until October doing legislative work, so they'll go home. They've got big major national issues on their plate, like financial regulatory reform. They just finished health care, et cetera. So we don't actually think they're going to pass a cyber bill this year, but we're continuing to work with them on some of these ideas and some ideas of our own. The last thing I'll say about legislation is, I talked a little bit earlier about the regulatory regime and how, Nuclear Regulatory Commission is regulating nuclear power plants with respect to cyber as well as physical, but that it's not uniform across all the infrastructures. So it's very variable. And so one of the things we've been discussing with the Congress is whether or not there should be more uniformity in the cyber area and probably not have DHS set the regulations, because it's actually better to have the expert regulatory agency do it, but maybe DHS should set standards that the regulatory agencies would adopt for their particular sectors. So that's another piece of it that's under consideration and conversation with the Congress.
You mentioned the concept of dimes in terms of cybersecurity, diplomatic, intelligence, military, and economic. Whether it be STRATCOM or NSA, they kind of have the latter part of dimes taken care of. In terms of diplomatic sense, obviously with China and issues such as that, where do you see that aspect going in terms of cybersecurity? Do you ever see something similar to an arms control agreement like the WMD field, anything like that? Where do you see the diplomatic aspect going?
No, great question. I really like that. So I 2 points on that. First of all, we did see at the time that of the Google attacks, right, Secretary of State Clinton did come out and say foul. She called foul, and the angle there, if you looked at that, was particularly it wasn't about the economic espionage part of the Google attack so much as the fact that the attackers also targeted email accounts of dissidents. So it was the free internet, free speech piece that the U.S. raised some sort of diplomatic objection to. So there is a diplomatic piece to this thing. It's not, and another piece of the diplomatic part, of course, is, well, as you were saying, what kind of international agreements can we have in this area? So one example of something that we already have is the International Cybercrime Treaty, which basically many nations have signed on to and allows us to share information with law enforcement agencies in other countries to deal with cybercrimes and help with investigations and prosecutions and extraditions of cyber criminals. As far as an arms control treaty, there have been some discussions about that, and what I like about that question is that we're all in cyber. We're all drawn to these analogies. So we say, okay, well, if we did it in weapons of mass destruction, can we do it in cyber? Somebody was saying in an earlier conversation I was in earlier that, okay, so let's think about the way we thought about the airspace of the United States before 9/11. We thought, well, the FAA is responsible for protecting the airspace. And then, these guys plow their airplanes into World Trade Center. And we're like, well, wait a minute. Now, the military has the ability to protect those. So now, if there's that kind of scenario, right, Northcom scrambles jets and has procedures and protocols for dealing with that kind of thing. So the argument was being made by use of this analogy in the conversation I was in earlier today, that therefore, if there is a cyber attack, we should scramble the Defense Department and have them, shoot down the cyber attackers or whatever the analogy is. The only problem is that, in the airspace, it's clear that the military has dominance, right? We have the best fighters, better than anybody in a 747. And that's not so true in cyberspace because of the way that the cyberspace is structured in the private ownership. So, in fact, in a lot of these attacks, the internet service providers, the ISPs, are the first line of defense, and they have a lot of technology that's available to them to manage their traffic just for business reasons that can be applied in a defensive way. So the reason I brought that sort of long piece up is that it's very attractive and seductive to argue by analogy, and it can help us understand it in part. But no one analogy exactly fits. So in some ways it's like the airspace, but in some ways it's like the law of the sea, which is there's the high seas, and national sovereignty only goes so far. And so what I've become convinced about in that arena is that there's not any one analogy that really covers cyberspace, and it's kind of a new domain, and we're kind of feeling our way. So the short answer to the long answer to your short question is that we need to have an international regime. We need to have agreements with other countries. We need all the things that we're used to having in conventional, relationships between states and between parties that are not well built out or not well understood. I mean, we don't really, in a case of a kinetic attack, right? We can tell where it's coming from. In cyberspace, you can't tell where it's coming from. In the international law of war, right, there's proportionality. So if somebody, does a small attack on you, you're not supposed to do a huge attack on them back. We have these, rules of war. So there's no doctrine of proportionality or understanding of what that means in cyberspace yet. So a lot of this policy stuff is very hard and needs good people to think about.
Using biometrics for the U.S. visit program, do you see DHS using that on a broader level for border control security, along with like Graham and Schumer discussing immigration reform? Do you see that being one day being a part of that, and using biometrics along the line to control immigration on the borders?
So U.S. Visit is a part of my part of DHS, and it provides basically biometric services to the rest of DHS. It has a big database of people and their biometrics. And so the question is really a great one, which is about, okay, so how does that information, how and where does that information get used, and what are the protections around that? So, I think as a predictor of the future, I think yes, going forward, we're going to be the government will use biometric and any other data that it has available to itself to perform its mission and protect the country. So without being able to say the specifics of where and when, I think the general trend is that when you have information, it gets used. So obviously there are concerns about that. We need to make sure it's used in a way that guarantees, preserves American values, including privacy, civil liberties. But I think the trend is that the more data that you have, the more likely you're going to use it in those kinds of situations.
Hi there. Recently there was Ironclad received a lot of press as a means to protect one's assets, computer assets. Is there other technology that's being adopted by the government that you may not be aware of that you can talk about?
So,
is there a shift, and are you using Ironclad yourself?
Well, I don't know if we're using Ironclad. Tell me what Ironclad is.
Oh, okay. I guess. So Ironclad is this thumb drive basically that you plug in to any computer in the world, and it plugs into any network. It plugs into your network, I should say, very securely. And so if you lose it, they can send a signal to destroy it. So it's it's a great way to travel.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a good example. Yeah. So the thumb drives are a problem, right? And we've had the government, not DHS, but elsewhere in the government, there have been some significant problems with you get a free thumb drive at a trade show. Well, what's on that, right? So where's that been? You have to be careful. You don't know where it's been. So anyway, or people just bring it in from home, and it's got virus on there from their kid's computer game and stuff like that. So thumb drives are a big problem, but they're very convenient. So there's issues. The Defense Department for a while had banned the use of thumb drives, and now they have reinstituted the use of thumb drives, but they have to be secure to some extent. And so as a general matter, I think there is still not a government-wide, just for the government side of things, there's not a government-wide policy on when and how you should use thumb drives. So we're still behind the curve on that in terms of catching up. The Defense Department, is ahead of us, ahead of most of the rest of the agencies on dealing with that issue. But I think that's a good example of two things. One is that what happens and what has happened in it's not meant for somebody who waves their hand. What has happened in this technology is that we continue to bring in new technology much faster than we develop security for it, and so this then, we go down this road, and then some big security problem shows up because of the technology. We go, oh, okay, let's get back and fix that. And the definition of insanity, right, is continuing to do the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results. So this is the case, and so the situation now is that we're trying to figure out how to get ahead of the curve and build an infrastructure that's inherently secure rather than continuing to be in a responsive mode for what is the latest threat or what is the latest vulnerability created by new technology, and how do we get that fixed. Why not build in security at the beginning and design the infrastructure so that it's inherently secure and defensible, so that then your problems are the stuff on the margins, not the stuff in the center. So that is one point. But the other point is that there's a lot of specific technology fixes. So that's a good example of fixing that problem. The Einstein program that I mentioned, which looks for malware and tries to block it, is another example. And each of those kinds of things is kind of a point solution for a part of the problem. And what it illustrates is that we have to have what we call defense in depth, right? Which is you have to have kind of a layered defense. And a big part of that layered defense, the defense in depth, is people. It's just the kind of thing about, and it's not just about, I think we're all beyond writing down well, maybe not all, but writing down our passwords and then putting it underneath our keyboard so somebody can get them. But the more complex things are, social engineering, old-fashioned spy tradecraft, right, of calling somebody up and saying, calling up the help desk and say, I'm Bruce McConnell and I lost my password. I've got something that's due for Secretary Napolitano right away. Can you just give me my password, please? And that kind of thing. And so dealing with those kinds of issues is a lot about training of the people who use it. So we're all part of the defense mechanism, just like we try and lock the door on our house when we leave.
Go ahead.
You mentioned the International Cybercrime Treaty.
Yeah.
Is there some treaty that lays out the appropriate response, for instance, like military engagement as a result of cyber attack and all that shit?
Right. So the answer is no. There is no agreed upon kind of law of war, law of conflict in cyberspace. So there's a long history, right? Thousands of years. We've been throwing rocks at each other and other more exciting kinetic weapons. So there's a lot of rules about that among countries, but there's not in cyberspace. We don't know how to deal with that yet. We don't even have coherent policies in the U.S. for how we will respond, in any detail. Did you have a follow-up?
Well, I mean, just looking at Russia, for instance,
Right.
it's attacked a lot of its satellite countries, and that it's actually using cyber attacks in its military strategy.
Right.
I mean, it seems like it would be sort of on the forefront of things to cover.
Absolutely. So obviously, we have, we've noticed what the Russians are doing, right? So you can figure out with major powers, right? If one is doing it, the other one is probably doing it too. But in terms of an international regime, it doesn't exist. Those conversations, are not well along, which is destabilizing. So it's an unstable environment.
Just wondering, you touched a little bit on attribution concerns related to cyberspace as well as privacy, U.S. persons concerns. I was wondering, with NSA and DoD having Title 10, Title 50 authorities, the best way to kind of leverage some of those capabilities for a attack outside the gig while still not putting lip service to civil liberty concerns and privacy concerns. What are your views on what DHS is working at to work sure that we have the right authorities around handcuffed if we deal with something?
Right. Yeah. So great question. And so we have a tradition in our country that military, we don't use the military on U.S. soil to deal with attacks on U.S. soil, except under certain exceptions and stuff. So there is, that's a good tradition. But as you suggest, also much of the capabilities that are available to us in cyberspace today belong to the military. So it's like, okay, well, how does that work? And then so what do we do to rationalize that problem? And in particular, so there's a couple different pieces to that. One of them is to develop capability on the civilian side of government at DHS to allow us, because Congress has given us the responsibility to defend cyberspace in the domestic arena. So, and in the meantime, while we're building capacity, and you all become cybersecurity experts and come to work for us, in the meantime, we work very closely with the military and with national security agencies. So the idea there is, one way to think about this is, by analogy, dangerous analogies, right, is that when the Coast Guard goes out in between the Coast Guard has the mission of interdicting drug traffic near U.S. waters, near the U.S. border, in waters near the U.S. border. But the Coast Guard only has limited capacity to do that in terms of number of boats afloat and that kind of thing. So the Navy does some of that work for them. But when a Navy vessel interdicts a drug runner inside the area which is in the Coast Guard's jurisdiction, the way that works is that they are operating under the authority of the Coast Guard. So there's this concept in the military of a supported command and a supporting command. So in that example, the Coast Guard is the supported command. It's supported by the forces of the U.S. Navy, which is the supporting command. But the supported command, it's their authorities, their more civilian-like authorities that are being used to do this particular mission. So similarly, we imagine you could imagine a regime that exists in theory at the moment, but that you would have DHS being a supported command, and it would be supported by NSA or somebody like that, presuming that you can get through all the privacy and civil liberties issues and rules about where the Defense Department operates in the United States.
Brandon, one.